If you play Warrior and follow the PvP scene at all, you'll often hear complaints about how impossible Warrior teams are to kill. So here's a question for you. Do you think your opponents are crying tears of frustration over their keyboard about how hard you are to beat an arena? If you're below 2400 rating, we can answer that for you. No, they're not. And before you start saying, well, my healer sucks, give us a moment to prove to you that by following the guidelines in this video, your team will become far harder to kill in arena, even if you have the worst of healers from the depths of LFG. Today, we'll be analyzing warriors from 3 rating brackets, 1300, 1900, and rank 1. As we go through, we'll be actively questioning you, the viewer, to see if you think like our low-rated warriors or our skill-capped resident rank 1 warrior Magnus. But before we get started, it's time for the question of the day. What do you think is the most OP defensive ability in the game? I personally think that Intervene is up there as the strongest cooldown, not only because it completely negates most melee damage, but with the Safeguard Conduit, it also provides consistent damage reduction on a 30-second cooldown, even against casters. Let us know what you think is the most OP defensive ability in the comments below. And of course, we want to make sure you all know about Skill Cap. It's the #1 place to improve at World of Warcraft, with hundreds of incredible guides created with the very best players in the game. The best part? You don't have to take our word for it. If you don't climb at least 250 rating while actively using Skill Cap, you can claim a full refund. Check us out right after this. And without further delay, let's get right into it. To kick things off, we're going to take a look at what's arguably the most OP defensive spell in Shadowlands right now, Intervene. With this one tool, warriors are able to completely shut down enemy pressure, giving them the power to single-handedly keep their team alive even in the most dire situations, no matter how bad their LFG healer might be. See, in the right player's hands, Intervene is comparable to a Holy Paladin's ultimate sacrifice, but in the wrong hands, it'll seem worse than a power word shield. And after analyzing games from over 50 warriors across a ton of rating brackets, we're seeing time and time again that warriors are failing to carry their team with perfect intervenes and are instead allowing it to be completely useless and irrelevant. The good news is that the skill of using Intervene isn't the hardest thing to master, it just requires planning ahead of time. This means that when you zone into the arena, you can already start planning ahead for when you're going to intervene. With that in mind, put yourself into the shoes of this warrior here. He's playing TSG, and he's up against a team with a Ret Paladin, Fire Mage, and a Holy Paladin, with these games being played at around 1300 MMR. Take a moment to consider when you would use your Intervene here. Alright, hold on to your answer for a moment and let's see how this plays out. The first thing we see is the enemy mage Dragon's Breath our warrior's healer into a polymorph, while our warrior's Death Knight gets put into a full Hammer of Justice. The Ret then uses Avenging Wrath, Divine Toll, and Final Reckoning. Now, hopefully at the start of this clip, you made the decision that your Intervene needs to be used on the Ret Paladin's offensive cooldowns. In addition, being mindful of when your teammates are stunned is also an important trigger for needing to intervene. Well, instead, what we see here is our warrior allows the Ret to chunk his teammates' health, forcing out both the pain suppression and anti-magic zone. Our warrior then decides to use power word intervene to keep his DK alive. Then again, this intervene was basically as effective as a power word shield, given that it was all used after the DK had already been burst down and other defensive CDs were already traded. Instead, if we had seen the warrior trade intervene and die by the sword the moment the Ret used his offensive cooldowns, the DK's health wouldn't have even moved. Our warrior even feared the mage to get his trinket, so following this up with a Stormbolt would also shut down combustion, meaning the warrior had the opportunity to completely carry his team and prevent them from taking any damage. But that wasn't the case, and instead we end up with a warrior that might end up wondering why the heck his healer didn't just trinket out of the first polymorph to counter wings and combustion, instead of realizing that you can indeed carry the game, no matter how bad you think your teammates are. To that end, we've got a perfect clip that a lot of you might relate to. Think back to all your recent adventures through the LFG tool where your healer gets targeted and just dies in the opener. Surely you've been left feeling frustrated and hopeless that you can't seem to climb because your healer sucks. Well, here we've got a turbo cleave rushing down our warrior's Disc Priest. If you didn't know before and were unable to catch it in the first game, Intervene should be used as a direct counter to offensive cooldowns, especially when paired with stuns while your teammates are still high on health. You can then pair these high-value intervenes with your die by the sword to soak up and negate a ton of damage. This frame here is the perfect example of a prime time to intervene. But as the clip plays out, the intervene just never comes and the Disc Priest goes down really quickly. Now, we're not denying this warrior's healer is clearly making things very chaotic by dying in the opener. But who cares if you're not doing the right thing yourself? If your healer is bad, you make the problem 100 times worse by also being bad yourself. It's a simple fact that when you make your healer's job harder than it needs to be, you're going to expose just how bad they might be. Anyway, you have all the tools you need to carry these healers that instantly die whenever they're targeted. And your reward? Well, you get to make up for the fact that your healer might actually suck. So look to yourself and question whether or not you're getting full value out of spells like Intervene to keep them alive, instead of quickly falling back on the age-old trend of my healer sucks and blaming them for dying in the opener when your Intervene wasn't even bound. Alright, that's pretty much how most warriors at 1300 use their Intervene. It's either just as good as a small shield, or it's not used at all. But how about as we climb higher? Do we start to see warriors use Intervene properly at 1900? Let's find out. Again, the warrior we're looking at is playing against a Ret Paladin. So much like in today's first clip, we're looking to see our warrior react to Avenging Wrath and use Intervene to keep his teammate alive. As the clip plays out, we do in fact see the first big difference between the 1300 warrior and the 1900 warrior, and that's immediately reacting to Avenging Wrath. Unfortunately, in this case, the reaction is not what we want to see, as our warrior decides to move away from the Ret to minimize the amount of damage he takes. But all this does is leave his teammate alone in the middle to take the brunt of the damage. Now, some of you may be wondering why you ever want to intervene these cooldowns when you could instead just run away and avoid the damage like this warrior did. Well, if this warrior's teammate was on the same page as him and also tried to run away, they would take no damage, right? Well, not exactly. See, by trying to just run away on these cooldowns in a cleave matchup like this, the chances of being able to actually take no damage is next to impossible, as you don't exactly have a mage on your team to spam some polymorphs. You might also argue that whenever you intervene your teammates on big cooldowns like this, you just end up dying yourself, and that scars you for life. But fret not. This is just you trying to get out of jail for free and not realizing you have to pair Intervene with your Die by the Sword to completely shut down all the damage on both yourself and your teammate. Anyway, as we let the clip play out, we can see the results of our warrior's decision by glancing over at details, with enemy team doing over twice our warrior's team damage without having to trade a single defensive cooldown themselves. Meanwhile, our warrior's team has already used a ton of defensive cooldowns. Again, all because of our warrior's decision not to intervene and die by the sword in the opener. Eventually though, we do see our warrior decide to trade his intervene and die by the sword to keep his demon hunter alive just as he was on the brink of death. But as JoJo once said, it's just too little too late, as our team has fallen significantly behind on cooldowns due to not shutting down the ridiculously front-loaded damage from the enemy Ret's Avenging Wrath, resulting in a fairly quick loss. So, between our 1300 and 1900 warrior, we still see intervene not being traded with enemy cooldowns, and instead, it's just coming out when their teammates have already dropped quite low. But why don't my teammates just use their defensives like they did here in order to survive, you might ask? Why do I have to trade my defensives to keep my team alive, you say? Well, just think about this for a second. First, most people can't use defensives while stunned. Okay, the Demon Hunter didn't get stunned in the opener here, fair enough. But what about the fact that you just straight up take less damage than pretty much every other class? You're wearing plate and you have passive damage reduction from defensive stance. You even have Ignore Pain to help mitigate more damage. And whenever you do trade Die by the Sword, it's legit just a 90-second cooldown with the Stalwart Guardian conduit. But even if your Die by the Sword is on cooldown, you should still be intervening to soak up all the damage. Defensive stance paired with Ignore Pain mitigates a ton of damage and allows you to carry your team. So, all things considered, you'd be crazy to not want to redirect damage to yourself whenever possible. Now, you might be thinking to yourself that the only reason why Intervene isn't coming out here is because Ret Paladins are OP. They just kill my team through everything, so I'd rather save Die by the Sword for myself. Well, even though that argument is completely false, and a simple Intervene plus Die by the Sword will stop pretty much all of their damage, it really doesn't have anything to do with Rets. Here's another example where our warrior is facing what's essentially the same composition, except the Ret has been swapped out for a warrior. Hopefully by now you fully understand the exact moment we're looking to see Intervene being used. But just in case you haven't, we've put together a helpful flowchart to help streamline your decision making. What's important to note here is that you should actually be reacting to your teammates' health last and will instead react to offensive CDs and crowd control first. First, you consider if the enemy team has used offensive cooldowns. When this condition is true, take a second to evaluate how large the threat is and use that to determine if an intervene is needed. For example, a Ret Paladin using Avenging Wrath is usually a good indication to instantly intervene, and even pair with your Die by the Sword to shut down all damage, whereas a warrior using Avatar might not be enough to warrant an intervene. It's up to you to broaden your game knowledge by watching guides like our video on how to instantly gain rating in PvP to find out where the biggest threats come from. Next, if no big offensives have been used, you can check to see if your team has been put into crowd control that provides a significant threat to your team. You'll of course have to consider both the crowd control on your DPS partner and your healer, in addition to how much damage the opposing team is capable of outputting. For example, seeing a stun land on your DPS partner against a comp that doesn't deal much sustained damage while your healer is completely free means that you can usually hold onto your intervene, whereas you'll usually get a lot of value out of intervene by just trading it for stuns on your partners against cleaves that are capable of outputting a ton of damage at any point. In addition, the moment your team has been cross-crowd controlled or a lengthy CC chain is starting on your healer, such as a polymorph from a mage or a blind from a rogue, intervene will also be a great trade to prevent your team from dropping low while your healer is CC'd. And finally, if none of those are true, you can use intervene if your teammate is low on health in a last-ditch effort to save them. Okay, back to this game against the Warrior, BM Hunter, and Disc Priest. Right off the bat, we see the enemy team coordinate their crowd control to trap our Warrior's healer and stun this Demon Hunter teammate. The enemy Warrior also uses Warbreaker and Avatar. Referring back to our flowchart, we can immediately see that both our first and second conditions are true, which means this is the perfect time to intervene. Once again though, we don't see the intervene used, which results in the Demon Hunter dropping low and his auto darkness being triggered. Even as the game goes on, we still don't see intervene being used despite the third decision being true, as the Demon Hunter drops very low on health, which results in him using Netherwalk. Just like in the previous game, all of this damage could have been prevented with an intervene paired up with a Die by the Sword. So by now, we've established exactly why it's important to intervene early, and we've squashed some of the arguments you might have against using intervene because it might be detrimental to yourself. Remember, it's a team game, and as a warrior, you're one of the most durable classes in the game, which should make soaking up damage for your team in critical moments sound very appealing. On top of this, if you have been falling into the age-old habit of just blaming your healer for letting you down, you should now also understand just how powerful intervene is and the reason why you can single-handedly carry the game, even if you're used to blaming your terrible LFG healer for letting you down. It's now time for us to prove to you why the skill difference in using intervene is truly unreal. As we said earlier, in the hands of some warriors, they're basically applying a power word shield to their teammates. On the flip side, someone like Magnus, a multi-rank 1 top-level warrior, is so consistent with his intervene, he's basically like a robot. He knows when he wants to intervene, and he does it immediately. Here, Magnus is up against a warrior mage team while playing Turbo himself. Before the game even starts, we can refer to the intervene flowchart and already know what situations to look out for. For the first one, the moment we see offensive cooldowns like Warbreaker and Combustion used on our teammates, we'll know it's a great time to intervene. If that condition isn't met, Magnus will look to see when his shaman is stunned, or his healer is put into some form of crowd control, such as a polymorph from the enemy mage. In both of those situations, his teammates will be left vulnerable, and it's up to Magnus to carry the game by using a well-timed intervene to negate a majority of the pressure. As the clip plays out, we see both teams trading blows without much happening. Stormbolt is used on Magnus's shaman, but with a lack of high sustained damage and no crowd control on their healer, their team isn't really threatened, so there's no trigger to use intervene. Moments later, however, the enemy mage lands the Door of Shadows on Magnus's healer and starts to cast a polymorph. With a lengthy CC chain now initiated on his healer, Magnus is primed to use intervene and shut down this kill attempt, and that's exactly what we see, with intervene being used as soon as the polymorph lands, before Magnus's shaman even drops below 80%. This time, we see Magnus in a turbo cleave mirror, where momentum is king, as both teams are capable of dishing out huge amounts of sustained damage at all times. This means we'll be looking to see Magnus trade his intervene the moment offensive cooldowns or stuns have been traded. And just like that, with Stormbolt, Avatar, and Warbreaker used in the opener, Magnus doesn't skip a beat and trades his intervene immediately, allowing his teammate to stay top through his initial pressure. What separates Magnus from the other warriors we showed you earlier is not only the fact that he uses intervene at the right time, but it's also the consistency. Again, with cross CC landing on both Magnus's shaman and priest, intervene is traded almost instantly and paired up with an ignore pain in defensive stance to soak up the damage and keep his team in the game. Now, before we leave you, this final clip showcases why even though our flowchart is an excellent basis for choosing when to intervene, you are at the end of the day one of the god classes of Shadowlands, with tools beyond just intervene that can be used to carry your team and keep them alive. Magnus completely outplays this RMP's opener with a Blade Storm that immunes his cheap shot. This lets him stun the mage, disarm the rogue, and Warbanner the follow-up polymorph on his healer. The end result is that Magnus gets to hold on to his Intervene despite the enemy mage using Combustion, all because he shut down their entire opener on his own. So, although you should be trying to trade Intervene at these optimal times, remember not to neglect all of your other tools. Now, as this game continues, DRs come off, the enemy team gets their stuns ready again and look to set up more cross-CC. Remember, Magnus already knows the type of comp he's up against and what sorts of situations he should be looking out for to intervene. One last check of our flowchart stresses the importance of significant crowd control on your healer, and with a blind being used here on Magnus's healer, he trades out the Intervene and actually redirects the rogue's kidney shot onto himself while he's in defensive stance, effectively shutting down yet another setup from the enemy team all by himself. Anyway guys, that's going to wrap up today's guide. Hopefully you all learned just why it's so important to utilize Intervene in the right way. And don't forget to check out skillcap.com/wow if you're serious about improving and want to pick up on some of the high-level warrior skills we just showcased by watching the warrior course and commentaries on our site. Thanks for watching everyone, see you in the next one.